Hi, Jodie, and welcome to this summit video. It's great to have you. And I've been reading on your website and a bit about what you do and a couple of interviews. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting into this subject, one of my favorites to work on, I think, in the context of long COVID. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and speak a little bit about what led you to this point now. I think I read that you used to be a journalist and then you transitioned into working in this field. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yeah. So I am originally from London. I'm currently living in LA, and I was a journalist for many years, specializing in entertainment. So a lot of red carpets and award ceremonies, and things were going very well. And then I basically got shingles and struggled to get better. I thought it'd be a week or two, and months later, I was still finding myself feeling exhausted, brain fog, my digestion wasn't working well, my body was hurting. So I felt like I permanently had the flu, and I had lots of different tests. And with a background as a journalist, there was no avenue that I didn't explore in terms of trying to get well, and couldn't quite find anything that gave me sustained recovery. So I might feel a bit better, but then it kind of went back to how it was. And this went on for about 3 years. It was a really challenging time. And then I was eventually diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. But as people may know, sometimes you get a diagnosis and you think that's going to lead to a solution, and it doesn't. I eventually read an article about somebody who took a brain training program called the Lightning Process, who had chronic fatigue syndrome and recovered. And that started a journey for me of learning a bit more about the mind-body connection, about our body's natural capacity to heal. It took me a little while to sign up because it was new information and I didn't really know very much about it. But I eventually signed up for the course. It's a training program that you do for 3 days, and then you have follow-up sessions with a coach afterwards. And that for me was the thing that turned things around. I finally understood how and why I'd got stuck in my recovery and what to do about it. And when I started to practice those tools, I was exercising again after 3 weeks, and I was back at work after 6. And it really changed my life to the point where I went back to working as a journalist again. And then when we moved to America, I felt that calling I had to investigate more and learn more about becoming a practitioner in mind-body brain retraining, that was my time. So I then trained as a Lightning Process practitioner, and that's one of the things I do now. I work with other people who have chronic health conditions like CFS, fibromyalgia, chronic anxiety, depression, pain, and over the last couple of years, a lot of long COVID clients. And I also have a separate company called Mindflex, where I work in a more corporate setting, and I speak to employees about ways they can use some of these tools in a more general setting to improve their health and well-being.
Great. Thanks a lot. It's great to hear about your transition and journey and how you made this into your career. I feel like this is often the path that people go down, where they have an experience themselves and then want to share. On your website, I read that there are kind of 3 modalities that you work with in regards to the Lightning Process. So psychoneuroimmunology, the physical emergency response, and neuroplasticity. So I think it would be great just to summarize what those are, and then maybe speak a little bit about specific examples, because I know that, for example, the physical emergency response, the fight and flight, I'm more familiar with Peter Levine's work from the Somatic Experiencing Institute. And I really like how, the videos that he has where he shows animals' stress response and how they're able to kind of release stress through these movement patterns, and how humans have kind of lost the ability to do that. And then we get trapped in this fight and flight and we're not able to get out of it. And I think that one thing that I noticed just looking in general, actually, at the different practitioners of Lightning Process and even the Lightning Process website itself, it sounds really abstract, and it's hard to kind of imagine what are the examples of things that people need to do, and then how does that lead to change. Because I think when you actually try it yourself or have some familiarity with different practitioners, you know what that is, what that looks like. But just interfacing with the websites, it can be quite abstract for people. I mean, this is a really big question, but if you can find ways to kind of approach it.
Sure. Let me know if as I'm chatting about answering the questions, but I totally see what you're saying about some of the information being a bit abstract. There is so much to it that it's either everything would be very complex or everything would be quite simple. It's much of a gray. So what we tend to do is keep things as simple as possible. And then exactly as you said, when you start to speak to a practitioner, you start to learn a little bit more information. One of the first steps with the LP is to listen to an audio program, which is written and narrated by the founder of the LP, Dr. Phil Parker. And that's 4 hours that explains all of the sort of key concepts and how the seminar works. It's also in a book form. And then before anybody signs up for the LP, I as a practitioner and my other practitioners as well, there's a lot of conversation to check that it really resonates with that particular person. It's really important that whoever does something like brain retraining or looks at nervous system regulation, that they have enough of a sense that they think, yes, this could work for me, and don't quite understand the how, but this makes sense in the context of what I'm experiencing. So as much as we can, we try and make sure that people who take the course are on board. If somebody doesn't believe that they can use their nervous system to heal, it would be a pointless exercise, because it's a training. So you have to practice those tools. It's like you can't just go to the gym and have a personal trainer and then not do anything in between. You need to actually practice to get the results that you want. That's why, to begin with, a little bit vague. If I explain some of the concepts, that might also help. So when people are dealing with chronic illness, and we'll talk about long COVID because of the we're in, but there's something like 200 different symptoms under the long COVID umbrella. No client that I've seen who has long COVID, it doesn't look the same for everybody. There are a few main similarities, I'd say, usually around similar to that I was experiencing with CFS, which is fatigue, brain fog, body pain, digestive issues. There's often some breathing issues, the chest area, things like that. I've totally lost my train of thought. What was my point I was just trying to make?
I think you were talking about, we started talking about how they're quite abstract, their abstraction, and then you were saying the key features of
the key concepts.
Key concepts.
So, but because there's so many different symptoms that people are experiencing, one of the really exhausting things for somebody dealing with long COVID is seeing a million different doctors, a neurologist, a dietitian, this body system, that body system, and you don't even know where to begin, and they don't all talk to each other. So in communication, what I look at is, if you think about all of our body systems like cogs in the back of a clock, they're all connected to each other. So when you negatively affect one, that can negatively affect the next one and negatively affect the next one. The same happens in reverse. But when you positively affect one body system, because it's connected to another one, it's going to positively affect it, and so on and so forth. So what I look at is somebody's dealing with lots of different symptoms that's showing up in lots of different ways and differently from day to day. Some days it's okay and some days it's not. What is underpinning all of these systems? What is the communication system between them? And that's the nervous system. So we're really looking at how do we get that nervous system in the most regulated state possible? Because my belief, and science tells us, that our body is designed to heal. It has that automatic process instilled within all of us. So when it's not, what is going on? What's getting in the way of that? So for COVID, why do some people get COVID and get better? And why do some people get COVID and they don't? That's really what we're looking at. And what I tend to find is anybody who's dealing with a chronic illness, meaning they're experiencing symptoms for over 3 months, sometimes it can be years and years. I've worked with clients who've been ill for 40 plus years. We're looking at a nervous system that's kind of like this. And when this happens, our immune system gets suppressed. So I'll explain one of the big key concepts that you mentioned that were on my website about the fight and flight response. I'm sure you know about this and many people watching may be familiar, but we have this amazing autonomic strand of our nervous system, which just does its stuff without us having to consciously participate particularly. We just know how to digest food. We know how to be creative and think clearly. We know how to regulate our body temperature. You break a leg, it's not the bandage on the outside that heals. Our body knows how to knit bone together. It knows what to do. So if you think about our autonomic nervous system as our parasympathetic and sympathetic, we're meant to be in parasympathetic mode for as much of the time as possible. That's all that automatic stuff that does its thing. And then occasionally something big, stressful, a threat comes in, and the sympathetic borrows all of that energy and has this massive response. So this kind of gets shut down, and this is like doing its work. It's like on alert, trying to figure things out. So in the case of somebody who's had COVID, they might have been well, as they get COVID, and the body goes, oh, I need that energy to deal with this situation. What's meant to happen is that we have this threat, and then it doesn't take very long, but we come out of sympathetic and back into parasympathetic, and everything starts working again. This is a very primal response, as you probably know. It's, in caveman days, we're talking about them hanging out in their caves and doing their thing, and occasionally seeing a saber-toothed tiger having this massive response, this life and death response, fighting off that tiger and surviving. And then it's like, whew, okay, cool, let's go back down to baseline. If you're talking about Peter Levine's work, this probably sounds quite familiar as well. What unfortunately is happening in modern day society is this amazing system. It's almost like our body hasn't caught up with the world. So we're still having this very primal response in a world that's moving like incredibly fast. And now, rather than having occasional massive threats, we live in a world where we are sort of drip feeding adrenaline into our system. It's little threats, little and often. So somebody might have a for example, with COVID, might be experiencing COVID, but it's not just COVID they're trying to recover from. There's all the other stuff in the world. There's the stress about when am I going to be going back to work? It's 24/7 news. I mean, it's not the case now, but it very much in the early days of COVID, it was very hard to get better. It was scary headlines. It was not very hope inducing, really. There's a loss of stress. It's financial stress. It's social media. It's all of these things. So it's much harder for this automatic part of our nervous system to get back into balance again. We tend to be sort of in this elevated state for a long period of time. When that happens, parasympathetic gets suppressed. It can't work in the way that it's designed to. An immune system, they're too tired. It's too tired to do what it needs to do. Our digestive system, you might be having the most expensive supplements and the cleanest diet, but if our digestive system is sluggish, it can't take all the goodness from those two things. So that's where we often start to see somebody might start off with particular, like the fatigue and the brain fog, and then a few weeks later they're talking about digestive issues, and then a few weeks later something else is added to the mix and something else. And the more symptoms somebody is experiencing, understandably, the more stressed and worried and concerned that they are, sort of permanently drip feeding these stress hormones into the system, which keep that nervous system out of balance again. What I want to do is think, well, what are the tools and techniques that people can use that will help get that system back into balance? And one of those is neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is basically our brain's ability to adapt depending on how we use it. And it's always on. It's always just listening for what are we thinking about the most? What are we doing the most? What's the story that we're telling ourselves? And very, very quickly it will adapt and change in that way. So if we are in this elevated state of stress for a long period of time in sympathetic mode, and we are worried and fearful and on long COVID support groups, which with the best will in the world are also saying, well, at month 6 this is going to happen to you, and at month 7 this is going to happen to you, we're permanently like, oh my goodness, how am I going to cope? What am I going to do? The brain goes, well, you're thinking these thoughts a lot, let me streamline this for you. Our brain is always trying to help. Let me streamline this for you and set up a way that you can think those things without even having to consciously participate in that. Permanently trying to make things as natural, as easy, as quick as possible. So without even realizing it, we are unconsciously then programming our mind almost to be in this permanent state, chronic state of fight and flight, of worry, of fear, of body scanning, of checking. My clients wake up, they're like, I just woke up feeling buzzy and anxious because of these automatic programs that are going on. So the brilliance with neuroplasticity is just looking for what you're thinking the most often. So as soon as you start to make a change in that, as soon as you start to add in some, rather than my body's never going to get better, you start introducing thoughts around, do you know what, I think I can trust my body. When I had that really bad flu a few years ago, a couple of weeks later, I was absolutely fine. And if I can have done that then, my body knows how to do it now, for example. So we're starting to feed in some more comforting, relaxing, calming, rest and digest sort of messages. If we do that frequently through neuroplasticity, and the brain's ability to adapt and change depending on how we use it, it recognizes it doesn't have to be in this permanent state of stress. It is safe to come out of that. And that's one of the methods that we do to start getting it back into balance again. And this isn't about fake positivity, because that doesn't help anybody. It's not pretending that everything is fine. It's the difference between noticing what we're experiencing and really thinking about what story we're telling ourselves about that. So I'm experiencing some pain. If we're going, this pain's going to last forever, I'm never going to get well, it's so much worse than it was yesterday, and we're thinking that day in and day out, that's going to have a very different response on our nervous system than, I notice this pain, I accept that it's there, I love and appreciate myself, I trust in my body's ability to heal. I'm going to use some visualization, meditation, calming techniques, breathing techniques, gentle movement, neuro-linguistic programming, which is one of the main modalities of the LP. It's looking at how our language and the patterns that we run at a very unconscious level, how this feeds into that balance of the nervous system.